Jacqueline Calmes, reporter for the Congressional Quarterly. You have a story in the May 23rd edition a couple weeks ago that has a headline on it: "Few complaints are voiced as closed or as doors close on Capitol Hill." What's that all about?
Well, we've started noticing recently that growing number of committee hearings, more markups of legislation than hearings, are being closed to the public and the press. And so I decided to look into it to see whether or not there was an increase in the number of closed-door meetings from the 70s, back when the Sunshine Movement opened things up, and whether and which committees were doing the closing and why.
What about the few complaints part of this headline?
Well, it's interesting because in the 70s, this whole movement was spearheaded by public interest groups, notably Common Cause, and by representatives of the press, although given their desire to be neutral in any issue of the day, took a backseat. But those two groups were at the forefront in the 70s, and now when you talk to them privately, they aren't complaining publicly. And when you talk to them privately, they say, well, some of the legislation is just better, or it's being put together in a more orderly way, and there's less influence of lobbyists when we're all kept out of the meeting.
Who's saying that? The press?
Well, some reporters will say that privately. People I know, and people in my office, people I know on the Hill from major news organizations, and the people from the public interest groups, the citizen groups, the so-called GUGU groups, good government groups.
Let me read you a quote from your own article by Congressman Rostenkowski, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. "When we came to this glorious, open, participatory government," Mr. Rostenkowski said, "you know, one of my members is sitting there looking at some labor skate and thinking," by the way, what's a labor skate?
Well, I assumed he meant a labor lobbyist, but he'd have to define the term for you.
Okay, let me read that again.
Labor flunky.
"You know, one of my members is sitting there looking at some labor skate and thinking, oh, well, how does he want me to go on this one? Or the labor guy is running around and pulling him out to say, wait a minute, you can't do this." Where's Mr. Rostenkowski on the idea of open hearings?
Well, Dan Rostenkowski was there in the 70s, and he wasn't an opponent, as I can tell from the record, of open meetings publicly. But he's from what his own colleagues call the old school. He likes things that are done in an orderly way where he can control the committee, and that's best done behind closed doors. And he's had to mark up the major tax bills of the last 6 years. And he sees more than any other committee chairman in Congress, except for his counterpart in the Senate Finance Committee, which does tax bills, that the influence of lobbyists on the legislation. And literally, you know, there's hand signals and eye signals and lobbyists taking members out of the room and constant coaching of which way to go and what to do on an amendment. And he, you know, just doesn't want to have to put up with that.
You quote Donald Pease, the member of Congress from Ohio, a Democrat, as saying, "I hate to say it, but members are more willing to make tough decisions on controversial bills in closed meetings. I fought like a tiger for you in there, but I lost. In a closed meeting, you can come out and say that," according to Mr. Pease. Is that true? Are there games being played when you have a closed meeting? The members come out and say, I tried for you, and they didn't?
I think so. The lobbyists will tell you they're not putting anything over on them. The members, Pease, others will say, they all describe situations where the lobbyists they'll meet with ahead of a meeting on marking up, drafting legislation, voting on legislation, that the lobbyist will want them to take a certain position, and they'll say, of course I will. But the lobbyists also, if it were open, the lobbyists would be in the audience wanting them to say, not just to take a position on an issue, but to offer an amendment to achieve that end, and to argue like crazy for it, and even if they were going to go down in flames on the vote, to demand a roll call vote, and the votes take time. Those are the kind of things Rostenkowski, the chairman, wants to avoid. And so they can come out and say, well, I tried, I brought it up, and, you know, the chairman knocked me down. You know, they can always blame it on the chairman, and Rostenkowski doesn't care. He's happier for that if it means he can get through in a shorter amount of time. But I guess the one problem is they say they're trying to keep out lobbyists. Anyone you talk to will tell you that between keeping out the press and the lobbyists are number one, that they want to keep out. Press is a close second, real close second. But the problem for the press is that the lobbyists find out. The press on the tax bill last year got most of its information from lobbyists who were out in the hall with them. There was a notable incident where a banking lobbyist was outside in the hall, and staff of the Ways and Means Committee handed out a slip of paper on which was printed the amendment the bankers wanted and the vote that showed they won. And the lobbyists ran down the hall saying, "We won, we won." And the reporters wrote about it, and the issue itself got enough, in the end, that did get coverage, that the next day the committee met and reversed its decision against the bankers.
Jacqueline Calmes, reporter for Congressional Quarterly, is telling us that more and more hearings are being closed. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that it's possible that there could be such a thing as too much sunshine? Or do you think that there ought to be more protests from the press? Phone lines are open, both in the East and in the West. The numbers are on your screen, as you can see. Begin dialing now. Remember our 30-day policy. Please don't call us if you've talked to us within the last month. Few objections from the press is a subhead on your second page here. Let me read a little bit. Reporters rarely object to closed committee meetings. That surprises Lawton Childs, senator from Florida who served in the Florida legislature, where reporters used to have to be forced from a room. Quote, "They could care less," he said of Capitol Hill reporters. "A lot of them just work through their sources and feel like open meetings just open it up so everybody's got the same shot at the information." And in the case of where they're televised, even the public has the same shot at the information. Is it true that there could be reporters groups in cahoots with this and not protesting very loud because it serves them best not to be in there?
Oh, not in cahoots, but definitely not averse to what's going on. Averse in principle. No one will tell you that in principle they think closed meetings are a good thing. But you get some of the major organizations up here, like the Wall Street Journal, the wire services, AP and UPI, New York Times, Washington Post. Those people do work their sources, and it is a scoop, quote unquote, to get something the next day through your lobbyist sources and member sources and staff sources that the other papers haven't gotten.
Let me read a quote that you also have in here from the bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, Al Hunt. "I'm not an advocate of closed meetings," said Albert R. Hunt, Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, but he added, quote, "Just speaking very, very selfishly, we did better when meetings were closed because we knew the Hill, we worked it hard, we got more stories."
He's right. I mean, that there embodies the sort of dilemma that reporters have. The Wall Street Journal in particular, and they do work hard, they got a lot of stories. I don't think, though, that it necessarily means that other reporters work less hard, perhaps, not to come up with those stories. The Wall Street Journal is an organ that members want to be quoted in or want to give information and have good relations with.
I've got your publication here. This is an earlier edition in May, the Congressional Quarterly, which is kind of an insider's publication.
Right.
Is it good for you? Do you have sources? And therefore, more people are going to need the Congressional Quarterly if you don't have open meetings and you have to scurry around and get special stories?
We could never approach the sources of, I suppose, the Wall Street Journal and the others, but we all work hard, and I think we have a lot the same sources. There's not the maybe self-serving interest in getting information into CQ if a member wants to get information into the public realm. Our advantage is that we are an insider publication in that every member's office on Capitol Hill gets it. So if members want their colleagues to see or find out something, it can get in CQ.
Who's starting to close the hearings?
It's mainly the Ways and Means Committee, I found. And that's, I think I should say that most meetings on Capitol Hill, most hearings are held in the open. And it's just some of the notable, the major committees, of which Ways and Means is one, and some of the major legislation, which is getting marked up in these closed meetings. The tax bills, this year, the major issues of the Congress so far, catastrophic health insurance, welfare reform, they're being marked up in closed meeting. So, and this, so far, we're on the House side. I can't speak to the Senate side yet.
Jacqueline Calmes, reporter for Congressional Quarterly, our guest for the next 50 minutes. She's originally from Toledo, Ohio, master's in journalism from Northwestern University, has a bachelor's in journalism from the University of Toledo, currently covers the institutional aspects of Congress, has been for the Congressional Quarterly since 1984, previously worked for some Hart Hanks newspapers down in Texas and also the Dallas Morning News. We have a call from near your old university at Northwestern from Waukegan, Illinois. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I'd like to say politicians always like to be out front on TV. Here I am, let me be seen, until it comes something that's really important. And then, that the people, are really interested in. Then they say, oh no, cloak me behind the door, I don't want to be seen. And just like the lady is saying right here, well, I did my best.
Do you think it's a good idea to have all hearings open?
I think they should have like 3 channels like C-SPAN and watch continuously
Okay.
what goes on in Congress and the Senate.
Okay, thanks. What's your reaction to that? Do you think most people feel the way this man does?
I'd like to think so. But I think he's absolutely right in that members do like to get on TV, and that's why you'll never have all closed meetings. A lot of controversial issues are aired in public. The Energy and Commerce Committee is particularly active on the House side in oversight. It suits their purposes many times in that their oversight is questioning initiatives of the Reagan administration or policies of the Reagan administration. You have a Democratic-controlled committee that's taking issue with a Republican president. But there's any number. Hearings, like I said, are mostly open. It's only when there comes time to take the vote on the legislation.
What do you think when, and we just had a hearing on from yesterday with the Secretary of Defense before the House Armed Services Committee, in which they went into closed session after that. And in the morning you can usually pick up the paper and read what happened in that closed session. Is it a kind of a charade when that happens, or are there things that really are classified that never get out?
I guess we won't know. The Defense and Intelligence committees have a good argument for closing. That's not to say it's not often abused. They close routinely, and none of us would believe that everything that goes on behind there is a matter of national security that needs to be protected. Those issues always, intelligence defense issues, are always the areas where the leaks are so frequent and common because of the fact that what gets leaked is self-serving to the policymaker who's doing the leaking. They want to get their message across. So it's always easy to get some news out of those, but it's their version of the news.
Excuse me. Clinton, Missouri. Next, go ahead, please. Good morning. You're on the air.
You sure it's not Clinton, Maryland?
It is Clinton, Maryland. That's my fault. Go ahead. We just had the wrong name on the screen. Please turn.
I would like to see open committee meetings, but the thing that I have against some of these reporters is that they are subjective and not objective. Why don't they put balance and not their little quick smirks that benefits their column, which they want to put over their thoughts and their feelings?
Caller, can you give us
the whole thing.
Can you give us an example, a specific example of where you've seen this?
Well, let me see this.
You see it on television? Do you read it in the newspaper? Where do you see it the most?
In the newspaper. I saw it in the Washington Post, but right now it leaves me this morning. Some of the writers will more or less put their own subjective feelings into a column that they might write, or they might fabricate it, I think, after watching some of the things on TV, or say, for instance, like the PAC for the Senate. It's been on there. Mr. Byrd and Mr. Boring was they want the limited PACs and so forth. Some of the Republicans wanted to eliminate them altogether.
Yeah, and so where does the bias from the reporter come in? Where have you seen it?
Right, the reporters are saying that Mr. Byrd and Mr. Boren wanted the PACs to, just in a small way, whereas some of the Republicans were saying, let's eliminate it altogether. But when it comes out, it seems like these are the negative people.
Okay. You see this gentleman making a valid point?
Well, I mean, he's expressing a criticism that's been made, I guess, since time immemorial about reporters' objectivity. I guess I would just ask him whether he would rather have reporters, a neutral source, basically reporting the news, the version as they saw it, or does he want to rely on the version that the politicians and government officials are going to come out of a closed room and give to us? As to the specifics of the bill he's speaking of that's on the Senate floor right now, the Campaign Finance Reform Bill, I think that's a good example of where a little press subjectivity is a good thing. He has bought off on the Republicans' argument that theirs is the good side because they have a bill, a few of their members have sponsored a bill that would eliminate PACs altogether. Well, that's where you need to have a reporter come in and perhaps show that neither side, Democrat or Republican, is exactly totally selfless in this issue. The Democrats, Bob Byrd, they like to go on TV on the Senate floor and say that we're for campaign finance reform and limit PACs. And Republicans say, okay, do away with PACs altogether, but what they're not telling you is that PAC money would continue to go to party organizations and from them be funneled to the candidates.
So neither, in this case, neither side's telling you the complete story?
Exactly. So you need someone to do that, I think. And
Rose City, Texas. Let's go to the next caller. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I have a couple of information questions that I would like to ask on how you go about getting hold of the proper legislators to put amendments into present bills retaining to the grandparent law and abused children law.
You mean how? You want to know the names of the people?
I want to know who I contact for that.
Where is Rose City, Texas? What are you near?
I'm not in Rose City, Texas. I'm in Massachusetts.
Where in Massachusetts?
In Littleton.
Littleton, Massachusetts. Is that near Boston? Near...
Yes, it is.
Okay. Do you know who your congressman is?
I believe, I'm not sure because I used to live in another area of town. At one time, it used to be Studs.
Okay, thank you. Any recommendations on where she should go? Should she start with her own congressman?
I guess I would start with the congressman and call the congressman's office, and I suppose whatever, depending on what legislation you wanted to amend, they could give you the names of the committee members who are handling that legislation.
Long Beach, California, for Jackie Calmes of the Congressional Quarterly. Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to kind of echo a little bit what the previous caller was talking about. The discussion about bias in the press and that sort of thing. I believe that I can't imagine that any newspaper reporter is going to be any different than anybody else, that they're not going to have biases of some kind. And I think it would benefit the public to know, what those biases are, within a, or what, like I'd like to know when a reporter comments on, particularly on political affairs, I'd like to know who they voted for.
Okay, let me, and I want to caution our audience that this program is not about press bias, and we don't mind you bringing these things up, but we are talking about whether or not hearings should be open or not. And let's start with that. Should these hearings always be open, or is there a case to be made for some hearings to be closed because there are too many interferences with the committees?
Oh, in cases of national security and that sort of thing, I'm sure they should be closed.
Should something like a health insurance committee markup ever be closed?
Not in my opinion.
Okay, what about that? Is there any time, have you seen a time when it really does help a piece of legislation to have a closed hearing?
I don't directly cover the Ways and Means Committee, but people whose opinion I trust, let's say, make a good case for the process and the product being better, shall we say. That's not to say any of us, myself included, would say that it should be closed. I don't cover national security or defense issues either, so I can't speak to that, but I do know that routinely those meetings, any hearings, legislation writing is closed.
Jackie Calmes has written an article for Congressional Quarterly. Headline is, "Few complaints are voiced as doors close on Capitol Hill." We'd like your response to that idea, whether you think it's a good or bad idea. We've got a Kennebunkport, Maine call. Go ahead, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's Kennebunk, not Kennebunkport.
All right, we're having trouble this morning with these names out there. Go ahead.
I was calling in simply because I had been for a long time the minority staff director of one of the congressional committees, and I was going to offer a comment on this issue of open versus closed meetings.
Terrific.
Prior to the adoption of the rule requiring open markups and open conferences, I think the process of a executive session for the consideration of a bill was a far more meaningful process because the members came in and really honestly debated many of the issues, whereas I think today the tendency is to resolve most of the more controversial questions before you get to the markup, and it in turn becomes almost a pro forma show for the audience.
So,
without any real serious, hard give and take among the members. When they're standing there in front of the audience, they're playing to the audience, whereas in a closed session, they tended to really be addressing each other seriously on the issues. I can recall back when, for example, we held markups on some of the early environmental laws, on NEPA, for example, the Endangered Species Act, and various other environmental bills. This was in the House Merchant Marine Committee. If we had been having an open session, it would have been a disaster.
would you conclude from that then that the sunshine is not good for our country?
In that sense, yes. I think in terms of hearings per se, clearly they should be open unless there is something involving national security at issue. But in regard to a markup on a bill, or even more importantly, perhaps a conference between the House and the Senate, I think the process works much better if it's in private than in public. And the lady is quite correct, of course. You did have staff members running in and out of the room, passing messages to people, letting them know what happened. And frequently the messages were sugar-coated in many respects. But you did get the job done, I think, far more efficiently in that kind of an environment. I just wanted to add one more comment, in that I teach government now here in Maine, and I'm using gavel to gavel as my primary tool for educating the students on how Congress functions. And I think it's far better than any of the textbooks. And I think it's a great publication.
It's great to hear. Thanks a lot for the call. Good background. What do you think when you hear somebody who's been in the process and is not longer there and not defending it, but saying...
I think he must be absolutely right about the, although I'm not inside the closed-door meeting, I think he'd be absolutely right about members feeling freer to have honest, forthright discussions among themselves about issues and their differences on these issues. Human nature being what it is, I would guess that's true. And that is a good thing. It's just one of those things you have to weigh or balance whether you want a democratic government's policy made in the open or do everything behind closed doors. I think there's a medium. Proponents of complete openness are not so naive, I think, to believe that there wouldn't be something done behind closed doors. For instance, if you're going to be writing legislation and voting on legislation on a Tuesday morning, members would get together on Monday over lunch or in private meetings and thrash things out. I mean, I would expect that to go on if a chairman who ran a committee markup on legislation that fell apart would be considered a terrible chairman.
Fort Myers, Florida next. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I'm a first caller. I'm going to call in reference to religion. In the 88th Congress, there's a resolution, HS 49, that had to do with making the Eastern Orthodox Church one of the major faiths in the United States. Okay? This was brought about by a senator from Pennsylvania, my former, where I lived. And it was to honor the servicemen who fought and died for their country. I am an American serviceman in combat World War II. And we had chaplains today in the service. We have Orthodox Christians that have fought and died for this country. After me lobbying and writing to the president, my congressman, my local paper, the news press, won't print it because you say freedom of religion, they own the press, and I can get no body of about 50 people in Congress to honor us as one of the major faiths, and yet we talk about Russia. I'm going to listen to your answer.
Okay, again, Jackie Calmes can talk probably about anything over there in the Congress. We are trying to talk about openness and sunshine laws and hearings. Any comment on the gentleman's? Any recommendation to someone who is frustrated because they can't get the Congress to take up their legislation?
Well, it must be frustrating, but I have no other advice other than what he's been doing to work through his congressman. And
There's no magic touch that you can tell him to use.
no.
Plantation, Florida. Go ahead, please. Can't hear you. Can you speak up just a little bit, please?
Make a comment about that law. I think it's a very good idea. I came to this country from Costa Rica back in 1952 when Ike was president. And I think that this is one of the best things about a democracy, that you are going to be able to see your congressmen, how they act and how they talk to the public, even if they manipulate the system. And another thing I wanted to comment about, Brian, it is that I want to see how they vote in Contra 8. I would like an open session about this and see, like I heard in your program once, that someone wrote a letter to the Sandinista government and all that. I want to see like an investigation about that and make it public, because when they come to the president, they like to embarrass him in front of the cameras, but when they come to the Democrats, they don't like to anyone find out what they have done.
Okay, thanks. Any reaction?
Well, to her last comment, I don't think this is a matter that is restricted. It isn't Democrats that are closing meetings or Republicans. I guess I haven't said up till now that the House and Senate rules require that in order to close a meeting, you have to have a vote of the committee in open session with a quorum present. And so those meetings are being closed with Republican votes generally. Almost always the vote is nearly unanimous, and the only one on Ways and Means recently that's been voting to keep meetings open is a Democrat. I should say we had an unusual situation yesterday in which Ways and Means Committee marked up the welfare reform package, and the vote was 16-14, I believe. Don Peace, the sole Democrat, usually was joined by all 13 Republicans. And there you have a situation, I think, although I haven't I found out last night about this, so I haven't checked, but based on my conversations with Republicans in the past weeks, I think that it was an issue where Republicans and Democrats so disagree on what should be done in overhauling the welfare system, then Republicans disagree with what Democrats have in their package, their bill to date, that they wanted it was tactical on their part to have it out in the open and, fight this thing and show how messy it is.
San Francisco, go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
Thanks much to you and C-SPAN for the good work.
Thank you.
Question on the closed markup meetings. What happens to legislative record there? Is that available verbatim in congressional records someplace at a later time?
Good question. Thank you.
For the committees?
Yeah, are those markup sessions, is there a record that you can read?
There's supposed to be a record, and the vote is, any votes taken in closed session are to be provided afterward. I talked to Ray Smock, who's the historian for the House side. He's concerned about closed meetings because under a House rule, any record of a closed meeting is sealed for 50 years. So he's afraid that for researchers and historians who want to, say, go back and write about the process of enacting last year's historic tax bill, that the record of the committees will be closed for 50 years.
Meaning those last hours when they were always behind closed doors?
Not just the last hours. That particular bill last year that completely overhauled the tax code was marked up and worked on in closed session from start to finish. First in the House Ways and Means Committee, and then then it passed the House, went to the Senate. The Senate Finance Committee was in closed session, and then when the House and Senate got together in a conference committee to negotiate their differences, the conference committee was closed. So at all stages of the process, except on the floors, it was closed.
Fairview, Oklahoma, for Jackie Calmes of Congressional Quarterly. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
You're on the air. Good morning. You're on the air.
Yes, I believe that we should have more closed hearings and more closed meetings and less lobbying and less participation in the media and journalists.
Why?
Well, because we always get a different interpretation every time, just like on Weinberger yesterday being questioned about 15 times. It seemed like that people were making fools out of themselves with silly questions, which he'd repeated about 15 times.
And because of that, you think that they ought to be closed for people, so we shouldn't have to watch that?
Right.
Okay. Jackie Calmes, what's your reaction?
I guess it'd be the same as with the earlier caller. The people like that must have tremendous trust in the people they've elected to government. It must show a tremendous confidence in those people to think that, take their word as and their version of events as the only one, and to give them the freedom to, operate completely in private.
Next call is from Vestal, New York. Go ahead, please.
Right. Oh, I've been following the Iran-Contra hearings, and during the discussion of the Boland Amendment, it seems to me that they referred to the legislative history or something to that effect of the Boland Amendment. And I'm wondering if you say the committee meetings are held for 50 years, where did they get the complete legislative history on the Boland Amendment?
Good question. Thank you.
She does raise a good point, I think. What you would have, even when you've had a closed meeting, is a committee report, which can be quite voluminous. And in that report, written report that the committee releases afterward, they go to great pains to make sure the language reflects the various nuances and interpretations of the provisions of the bill that they want, the spin on things that they want. So your legislative history, I guess, in the case of a bill that was worked on in closed session, would include that written report and floor debate.
Union, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Ideally, I think all the congressional hearings should be open. But in view of the most congressmen's inability to make the hard choices, I kind of think we get a better product if things are closed. Thank you very much. I'll listen for your reply.
Okay. Have you seen it? How often have you seen it where it's closed and you're getting a better product? Is it hard to admit?
I'd be hard. And better, it's sort of hard to say better product. I mean, that would be for me to make a judgment on the legislation and what's in it. I think when reporters in particular talk about, they're looking at the number and type of special interest provisions that, say, a particular industry wants in there, which you get in, God knows, in closed, whether you're open or closed sessions. But I personally can't think of a bill I've covered that was worked on in closed session that was better for it. But that's not to say, I mean, like I said, I don't cover taxes and I don't cover defense and national security.
Talking about Jackie Calmes' article about some of these hearings on the Hill here in Washington being closed to cameras and to reporters and to lobbyists. What's your opinion? Melbourne, Florida, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, in asking my question, I have a couple of operative premises. The first of which is Congress is rising in ascendancy of power right now, or it's asserting its power more. I think it should be subject to the same scrutiny as the executive branch. The third thing is because Congress as an institution is very diffuse, it's hard to subject it to scrutiny. And don't the closed hearings make it even more diffuse as far as examination goes?
For purposes of comparison, let me ask you this. The president makes decisions in his cabinet room or in his Oval Office among his aides and comes out and announces them. Should the Congress be in that same position to go do that and rise or fall based on whether you like or dislike what they're doing and voting at the polls?
Well, I think you have a situation where the president
the term administration and the president are almost identical, and his reputation stands and falls based on what the administration does, whereas the Congress refers to itself as an institution, and there's no individual responsibility, even for the committee chairmen who have quite amount of power.
Jackie Calmes, what's your reaction?
Well, he's right, and what he's describing is why you have the old saw about people in the United States hate Congress, but they love their congressmen. It's because they hold Congress as an institution responsible for things, but their individual congressmen had nothing to do with any of those things, and so I don't know the answer to opening it up to greater scrutiny. I think that's a function of their local and state media to do that, to put a particular spotlight on their hometown and home state members.
From Melbourne, Florida on the Atlantic coast to Santa Ana on the Pacific coast. Go ahead, please.
Morning, folks. Hi, Jacqueline. As most people that believe in a free society, I'm also disturbed by these closed hearings. My question to you is, I wonder if perhaps the idea, the concept of Congress as we have it today is becoming outdated. With all the advances in electronics and computers, could we possibly have a more direct participatory system than we've had for the last 200 years? What do you think about that?
I think, again, the caller is right, and like most people who are in the middle of a revolution, which I think we are, we don't see a lot of the effects of at the time. But it's true, Congress, for better or worse, is the electronic and television changes have really opened it up to the public, and members are certainly aware of that, and it's a good thing. I really don't know. We've looked at TV, you know, C-SPAN's been covering the Senate for the past year, and we've looked to see whether there have been many changes in how the Senate operates, and no one can really point to anything in particular. But we know it's there. But in terms of the very people who call in and who are, I presume, also watching Congress day to day, it can only be a good thing.
Frankfort, Kentucky, capital city. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was calling in reference to your openness in Congress and seeing it on C-SPAN and one thing and another. I'd like to see more of it. It's probably one of the most disgusting channels I've ever watched, because I sit here and I watch our elected politicians and one thing up there argue and fight and carry on this Contra aid thing. My wife's telling me she's not going to allow me to watch the channel anymore because I get too tore up, too excited about what's going on. I just can't believe the people we elect can actually sit there and make such fools of themselves. Why don't they just, forget this business and go on to the next thing? This is the real world. This is what happens every day. I can't understand why we're sitting there going after Ollie North and one thing and another. I just don't understand it. And I guess I've been trying to call in here for 6 months, and this is the first time. I'd just like to say thank you for the openness. We need more of it.
Okay. Your reaction to gentleman's frustrated by what he's watching. Says it's the most disgusting thing he's ever seen.
Well, I think in some ways when he's surprised by the members we send up here, I guess I would just say it's a representative body, and if he's ever in groups just casually talking over issues and such, I imagine the tenor is much the same. And members of Congress are just one of us. And as for the Iran-Contra hearings, I guess I'm a little surprised that if he is watching it as much as he says, so much so that he's driving his wife crazy, I'm a little surprised that he sees so little reason for them in terms of it's widely known, and the polls show that the public has pretty much made up its mind about what the president knew and what he did. I think members of Congress, without myself passing judgment on the way they're doing it or the duration, whatever, I think they have a responsibility to actually put a document together that lays out actual facts and chronology, etc., without just jumping to a conclusion like the American public has done.
Jacqueline Calmes is a reporter for Congressional Quarterly. We're talking about her article that she wrote a couple of weeks ago about the number of hearings being closed, not open to reporters or lobbyists or cameras, and whether or not you think that's a good idea. Baker, Oregon. Next, go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm very much in favor of open meetings. At least it gives the public a chance to make up their own minds.
Caller, do you think that there's any time when the meetings should be closed?
Yes, in our national defense, or maybe if a committee has a personality problem within their own committee, it should be closed in those cases. But where it's of public concern, I agree it should be open.
Okay, thank you. Ethics Committee hearings on the Senate side and House side ever open?
Not in my experience. On the Senate side in particular, that generally, the Senate has specific reasons to close meetings that have to be cited. It's a stricter rule than the House. The House just lays out the process by which they have to close a meeting. Take a vote in open session with a quorum present. The Senate, you have, in closing a meeting, have to cite one of, I think, a half dozen reasons, one of which is personnel matters and matters of potential criminal charges, and oftentimes in a matter before the Ethics Committee when they're looking at their own members or employee of the Congress and alleged wrongdoing, those certainly fall under those restrictions.
Grand Rapids, Michigan, you're next.
Yes, good morning, Brian.
Morning.
And good morning, Ms. Calmes, I believe. I thank you for the opportunity to talk. I always enjoy C-SPAN.
Thank you.
That other gentleman who said that his wife didn't want him to watch, I sit here and swear like a trooper and enjoy every bit of it. And my wife says the same thing. She just walks out of the room. I agree that we should have closed meetings, and I agree that we should have open. But I think yesterday's example with the Contra Iran hearing, with a bunch of the CVS old men up there taking, and I'm in my 60s, I can say that, and making fools out of themselves over a lovely young lady. There were two, Rudman and oh my goodness sakes, from Georgia.
Mr. Jenkins was from Georgia.
No,
Mr. Nunn, Sam Nunn?
There's Mr. Nunn, Sam Nunn. Those two asked some rather pertinent questions. But I agree with her. I think many of those decisions are made before the open committee does become an open committee.
Let me ask you about, you say you understand when they're closed and you like them when they're open. Have you seen much harm being done over the last several years from having so much open?
Yes, I think so. I think that a great deal of posturing is done, and instead of actually having hearings, I think it's more of a political forum for so many of these people. Particularly, I'm not going to mention any names here, but some of the representatives' meetings that were on, not just Nicaragua, but the Philippines and things like this. In fact, when I saw Senator Lugar one time on TV, standing in the field, I believe in the Philippines, in the interfering in the internal affairs of a foreign sovereign, which we have state department, we're represented there, I get a little tired. But I got to ask you, I'm going to tell you something and I'm going to leave. I'm reading a book called Miracle at Philadelphia. And by the way, I enjoy it very much. Now, my neighbor wants to borrow it. He has a doctorate, so he doesn't have enough money. I mean, he's got a little... I only have a BA, a BS, I beg your pardon. But I'd like to point out that Constitution was written in a very, very, very secret society, a very secret meeting. In fact, I don't think anything's been more secret since. And in reading this book by Baker, was it Bauer, I believe, I understand again that if it had been an open meeting, we never would have had a Constitution. Any comment on that?
Jackie Calmes?
He's absolutely right. Not only was the Constitutional Convention closed, but the Senate was closed for the first 6 years of its existence, and unlike the House. What can you say? I would hate to see this Congress or any other Congress have to meet and draft an entire new Constitution. That's what all the trepidation is about the prospect of opening up a new Constitutional Convention with the measures that are pending in the states. 2 more states ratify a resolution to call a Constitutional Convention, and we're going to have one.
that's a good topic for another show because the two states have been there for a long time.
That's
Ellensburg,
right.
Washington. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello. I'd like to ask Jackie what she thinks of the concept of having a vote for open meetings rather than a vote for, like a quorum call, what you have now for having the meeting closed. In the same sense of like having a, like now I guess they vote for the roll call, whereas normally we don't see the vote. And
what would
that would change? That'd be kind of a reverse of the way the system works now, and meetings would work that way.
What would be the advantage to having them vote every time to open?
Pardon me, sir?
What would be the advantage to doing it that way?
I'm not saying. I think the advantage is to have the meetings closed, generally.
Should have them closed.
Yes, I think generally that would work better, so the politicians don't suffer politically as much.
Okay. What's your reaction to that, Jackie?
He says so politicians don't suffer politically. I guess I'm wondering why he wants to protect the politicians from themselves, but
are there things that both sides protect themselves? I mean, where the Democrats and the Republicans think alike and they protect each other?
Oh, certainly.
Any quick example?
Well, there was the example of the catastrophic health insurance bill that was marked up in Ways and Means. One of the members, when I asked, he said they didn't want the lobbyists in, that's why they closed the meeting. I said, which lobbyists? And he said the lobbyists for the AFL-CIO and the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. And certainly labor puts more pressure on Democratic members, but the senior citizens who are millions across the country who are members of the AARP put pressure on both Democrats and Republicans. And so you had in that catastrophic health insurance bill a sort of two-pronged approach where they were trying to expand benefits to elderly Medicare beneficiaries who have catastrophic illnesses. And that's a good thing. You know, members, like someone said to me, look like good Samaritans when they're doing that. But then they had to turn the next day and decide how they were going to pay for the expanded benefits, which is always going to mean either higher taxes or higher Medicare premiums for the beneficiaries, and that's not so easy to do.
Jonesboro, Arkansas. You're on with Jackie Calmes. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would, let me see, how do I want to put this? What I want to know first off is can a private citizen initiate legislation, and how would he go about doing it? But what I wanted to say before you start on that is that I am really intrigued and impressed by the electronics used in the legislative process, and I would love to see more of it. The C-SPAN show is fantastic.
Thank you. Speaking of electronics, we ever see the vote readout right after it happens in the House of Representatives, do you think?
On the floor votes?
Yeah, we don't, we only see the totals. You don't see the individual votes. Is there a reason?
That would be a good idea. You might know more than I about that in terms of why we in the House Press Gallery get a printout sheet within minutes with a breakdown of how the members voted. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be available to the electronic media to immediately.
It's available. I just wondered electronically if it, they could show. Let me go on to the gentleman's question about a private citizen.
I really don't know, except for the same advice we gave to a couple of the others of working through your member of Congress. Most of the legislation.
You can't drop it in directly, though. You can't just go to the House of Representatives and say, "Here's a bill," unless you are a member.
I suppose technically you could, but you have to. There's a real technical side of bill drafting. The legislative counsel's office drafts it, and there's a definite way of writing anything legal, and you'd have to go through channels somehow.
Fountain Valley, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to know how come we never get, as a private citizen, get any say-so in whether it's shown or not, or do you think we will ever know the real story on this Contra deal?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. There seem like two questions. What is shown or not?
If it really is it a cover-up?
Oh, I see. Well, she's asking a question about the Iran-Contra hearings. I don't know. That again is not our subject here. The question is, do you think we'll ever know the real story?
I think that's what the hearings are designed to answer.
Did you get any reaction out of your story on whether or not, let me read the headline again. Few complaints are voiced as doors close on Capitol Hill. Did anybody call you up and say you over-exaggerated?
No, I did get a call from Rostenkowski's office, Chairman Rostenkowski, who's quoted in there. Said it was right on target in terms of giving their side why they close it and the arguments against doing so.
Call from your old hometown, or not hometown, but where you used to work, Dallas, Texas. Go ahead, please.
Yes. We're a democratic society, and it's supposed to be a government for the people, by the people. Don't the people have a right to know everything that's going on?
Gentleman states the definitive question.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we, outside of national security, that we shouldn't have the right to see or know, you think, in a democratic society?
It's hard to know what that would be. I think some of the Senate exemptions in its rule for closing meetings, maybe you wouldn't want to expose things that are matters pending in a criminal court where the subject has not received due process yet, and a personnel matter, a complaint against an employee that wouldn't be fair to air.
Albuquerque, New Mexico, you're on with Jackie Calmes.
Yes, I would like to say that there is something wrong when they have to go into closed sessions when they want to discuss something they don't want the American people to hear. I think everything should be open. And one more thing, Brian, I would like to say. When they have news conferences, I think there should be someone else asking the questions besides these liberal communist news media that is constantly asking the questions. The same old trashy communists are always asking the questions.
Okay, thanks, Albuquerque. Any agreement there on anything he said?
Whether we're communists. No.
You know any communists in the news media?
No, not that I know of. What he said about everything being open, though, I mean, it's those alleged communists in the news media that would agree with him. But I think I'll play the devil's advocate and say that he said the government of the people, for the people, and the people's business should be done in the open. I agree. I just want to be the devil's advocate and say sometimes, many times, when the members vote to close a meeting, for a lot of them, it's because they think they can do a better job for the general population by closing the doors and taking tough votes. There are many who genuinely do want to keep out the lobbyists for a special interest.
Last call for Jacqueline Calmes from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hello. I would like to ask a question about the Iran-Contra hearings, the fact that millions of tax dollars are being spent on the hearings themselves. And my question is, what is the ultimate goal once the hearings are finished? And is there not a possibility that perhaps these tax dollars could be channeled elsewhere for something that would help the American public a little more?
Jackie Calmes?
Well, the Iran-Contra hearings weren't exactly my subject, but I guess I'll just say that the objective, if I could define it, is you have a basic it shows a basic split between the executive and the legislative branches in who conducts foreign policy, and the Constitution defines a role for both the executive and legislative branches, and we're going through one of those cyclical periods. We had another in the Nixon administration where there's a perception in the Congress that the president has taken on too much to himself and not consulted with them, and this is to sort of they're trying to bring the pendulum back, see exactly what did happen.
Let me ask you about the hearing itself and relate it to other hearings that go on. Is there a different legal reason for these hearings? Do they have a different objective than most hearings that are held on the Hill?
Well, certainly it's unique. I mean, you don't get hearings like this very often.
At the end, what is expected? Is there some kind of legislation that will come out of this, in your opinion?
I expect there will be a report issued by both the House and Senate committees probably jointly, in which there'll be a finding. They'll lay out the facts that they found and a finding of what happened both in selling arms to Iran and in privatizing the foreign policy in Central America.
Waste of money?
I guess that's for each of the taxpayers to make up their mind. You've had calls here. You had people who think there's a cover-up, that we're not getting enough information, and then people who think we're getting too much.
Congressional Quarterly is the publication. Jacqueline Calmes has been our guest for the last hour. The subject has been, should we open up hearings or close them? Better off for the society. Jacqueline Calmes is originally from Toledo, Ohio, a master's in journalism from Northwestern, a BA in journalism from the University of Toledo, has been with Congressional Quarterly since 1984, previous experience with the Dallas Morning News and the Hart Hanks newspapers in Texas. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for your comments and questions. Have a good day.
If you have further questions or comments for Jacqueline Calmes, you can write to her in care of Congressional Quarterly. The address is 1414 22nd Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20037.